Imagine a world where 1 out of every 3 people you know simply vanishes. Not in a war, not over decades, but in the span of just a few years. This was Europe in the 14th century, when a plague so devastating struck that it would fundamentally reshape human civilization. Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people across Europe, as much as half of the continent's entire population. This is the story of humanity's darkest hour and how it changed the world forever. This is Simple Story. Nothing is as simple as it seems. Let me clear for you. If you are ready, let's start. The plague probably originated around Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan, breaking out among communities there in 1338 and 1339. From this remote mountain lake, the disease began its deadly march along the ancient trade routes. China was ravaged by plague and famine from the 1200s to the 1350s, with its population decreasing from an estimated 125 million to 65 million by the late 14th century. The pandemic moved relentlessly westward, carried by merchants, soldiers, and the Mongol armies that controlled much of Eurasia. In 1345, the Mongol Golden Horde army besieged the Genoese trading city of Kaffa in Crimea. When plague broke out among the Mongol troops, their commander made a decision that would seal Europe's fate. The Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the city walls of Kaffa to infect the inhabitants. This act, one of history's first documented uses of biological warfare, succeeded beyond anyone's darkest imagination. The Genoese traders fled by ship across the Black Sea, unknowingly carrying death with them. In October 1347, 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. The scene that greeted those waiting on the docks was one of pure horror. Most sailors aboard the ships were dead, and those still alive were gravely ill and covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. Sicilian authorities hastily ordered the death ships out of the harbor, but it was already too late. The plague had arrived in Europe. The disease spread with terrifying speed. From Sicily, plague-bearing galleys reached Genoa and Venice in January 1348, and the outbreak in Pisa, a few weeks later, became the entry point into northern Italy. By November 1347, one plague-infected ship landed at the French port of Marseille, and within the first month, 56,000 people died in the city. By the middle of 1348, the Black Death had struck Paris, Bordeaux, Lyon, and London. The disease spread northwest across Europe, striking France, Spain, Portugal, and England by June 1348, then spreading east and north through Germany, Scotland, and Scandinavia from 1348 to 1350, finally reaching Moscow in 1353. What made the Black Death so uniquely terrifying was not just its reach, but its symptoms and speed. Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio described how swellings appeared in the groin or under the armpits, growing to the size of an apple or egg, which people called plague boils. Blood and pus seeped from these swellings, followed by fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, terrible aches and pains, and then, in short order, death. The disease caused fever, fatigue, shivering, vomiting, headaches, pain in the back and limbs, sleeplessness, apathy, and delirium. The buboes, swollen lymph nodes that gave bubonic plague its name, would turn black, giving the disease its dreaded title. Modern genetic analysis has confirmed that the Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which is spread by fleas living on rodents. But medieval Europeans had no understanding of bacteria or transmission vectors. The disease likely spread from person to person as pneumonic plague, which explains the quick inland spread of the epidemic, faster than would be expected if the primary vector was rat fleas. Pneumonic plague, the most infectious type, moved into the lungs and was passed directly person to person through airborne particles coughed from infected lungs. Without treatment, pneumonic and septicemic plague killed almost 100% of those infected. The death toll was staggering beyond comprehension. In crowded cities, it was not uncommon for as much as 50% of the population to die. Florence's population was reduced from between 110,000 and 120,000 inhabitants in 1338 to 50,000 inches, 1,351. At least 60% of Hamburg and Bremen's populations perished, and a similar percentage of Londoners died, with approximately 62,000 deaths between 1,346 and 1,353. By June 1348, monks reported 800 people dying every day in Paris, with modern estimates placing the death toll at 50,000 inches, the second half of 1,348 alone. Damascus was losing up to 1,000 lives every day at the pandemic's peak. The scale of death overwhelmed every aspect of medieval society. Bodies piled up in the streets because there weren't enough people alive to bury them. Paris was said to have buried 800 dead each day at its peak. Entire villages were abandoned. Crops rotted in the fields. The living envied the dead, and survivors walked through cities that had become graveyards. The disease was terrifyingly contagious. Boccaccio wrote that the mere touching of the clothes appeared to communicate the malady to the toucher. People died so quickly, often within 2 or 3 days of showing symptoms, that families had no time to prepare, no time to grieve, no time to understand what was happening to their world. Medieval medicine was utterly helpless against the plague. Doctors had no concept of bacteria or how diseases truly spread. Ancient physicians had promoted the miasma theory, poisoned air, to explain disease transmission, and medieval Europeans believed this caused the Black Death. Some physicians recommended bloodletting, others prescribed various herbs and potions. People thought warm baths permitted plague miasma to enter through their pores, so public baths were closed. None of it worked. The best advice doctors could give was to flee infected areas, but for most people, there was nowhere to run. In their desperation to understand why such a catastrophe had befallen them, people turned to religion and superstition. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Some people coped by joining processions of flagellants that traveled from town to town, beating themselves and one another with leather straps studded with sharp metal pieces in public displays of penance. Others sought scapegoats. Many thousands of Jews were massacred in 1348 and 1349, accused of poisoning wells to destroy Christian civilization. In February 1349, 2,000 Jews were murdered in Strasbourg, and in August of that year, the Jewish communities of Mainz and Cologne were exterminated. At least 235 Jewish communities experienced mass persecution and destruction during this period. But the Black Death didn't just kill millions, it fundamentally transformed European society in ways that would echo for centuries. Before the plague, Europe's social structure was rigidly hierarchical under the feudal system. The feudal system divided the population in a caste system, with the king at the top, followed by nobles and wealthy merchants, with peasants or serfs at the bottom. Serfs were unfree laborers, tied to the land they and their families worked from generation to generation, with no upward mobility. Europe was severely overpopulated, and there was no shortage of peasant labor. Serfs had no choice but to continue their work, which was essentially a form of slavery. As the plague wore on, however, depopulation greatly reduced the workforce, and the serfs' labor suddenly became an important and increasingly rare asset. For the first time in memory, ordinary workers had bargaining power. A lord could not feed his family or pay tithes to the king or church without peasant labor, and the loss of so many meant that survivors could now negotiate for pay and better treatment. Court records from 1,352 show laborers leaving their employment without permission, demanding excess wages, and refusing to work at stipulated rates, instead leaving towns to get higher wages elsewhere. The authorities tried desperately to maintain the old order. Governments enacted labor statutes attempting to fix wages at pre-plague levels and restrict worker mobility. But these laws largely failed. Workers pushed for higher wages and greater mobility, which they received because nobles were willing to make these concessions rather than work the fields themselves. Wages rose dramatically, land became plentiful, and serfdom had all but disappeared by 1,500 inches Western Europe. The lives of members of the lowest class vastly improved as they were able to afford better living conditions, clothing, and luxury items. The economic transformation was profound. The Black Death encouraged innovation of labor-saving technologies, leading to higher productivity, and there was a shift from labor-intensive grain farming to animal husbandry. Since plague left vast areas of farmland untended, they were made available for pasture. Putting more meat on the market, consumption of meat and dairy products went up. The erosion of feudal obligations and the rise of wage labor allowed many peasants to leave the countryside and seek opportunities in towns and cities. Urban centers grew, and with them came the strengthening of merchant guilds and the early stirrings of capitalism. Not everyone accepted these changes peacefully. In 1358, northern France was shaken by the Jacquerie, a major peasant revolt in which the bourgeoisie of Paris joined forces with peasants against the nobility. England was shaken decades later by the Peasant Revolt of 1381, a response to high taxes and attempts by feudal lords to extract servile dues from peasants. These revolts were brutally suppressed, but they signaled that the old social order was crumbling. Europe's population was cut by a third to a half, and it took nearly 80 years for population sizes to recover in most parts of Europe. In some areas, it took more than 150 years. The plague's cultural impact was equally significant. The Black Death drove an intensification of Christian religious belief and practice, but it also inspired extremist cults that challenged clerical authority. Combined with the death of many clergy and fears of sending students on dangerous journeys, heightened religiosity inspired the founding of new universities and colleges, which subtly undermined the unity of medieval Christianity. The plague also changed medicine. Doctors, tending the sick during the plague, learned from direct experience and began to rebel against ancient medical doctrine, becoming committed to a new empirical approach to medicine. The first quarantine was established in 1377 at the Adriatic port of Ragusa, and by the 1460s, quarantines were routine in the European Mediterranean. The Black Death never truly ended. The plague reappeared in 1,361 inches, what became known as the Children's Plague, because children born after the previous outbreak were not immune and died in disproportionate numbers. Fresh outbreaks occurred in 1379 to 83, 1,389 to 93, and continued into the 1400s and beyond. The plague would return to haunt Europe for the next 4 centuries, though never again with the same apocalyptic fury as the initial outbreak. Today, we understand what medieval people could not. French biologist Alexandre Yersinia discovered Yersinia pestis at the end of the 19th century. Modern antibiotics like streptomycin, gentamicin, and doxycycline are effective treatments, reducing mortality from 40 to 60% in untreated cases to just 1 to 15% when treated. But plague hasn't disappeared. The World Health Organization reports cases still pop up sporadically around the world, with most appearing in Africa since the 1990s. Within the United States, an average of 7 human cases appear each year, primarily in California and the Southwest. The Black Death stands as a stark reminder of nature's power and humanity's vulnerability, but it's also a testament to human resilience and our capacity for transformation. From the ashes of the worst pandemic in history emerged a new Europe, one where labor had value, where social mobility became possible, where questioning authority was no longer unthinkable. The plague destroyed the medieval world, but in doing so, it helped create the foundations of the modern age. The survivors of the Black Death emerged into a changed world, one where the old certainties had been swept away. They had stared into the abyss and survived. And in surviving, they proved that even in humanity's darkest hour, even when death claims half the world, life finds a way forward. The Black Death was Europe's greatest catastrophe, but from catastrophe came transformation, and from transformation came the world we know today.